Welcome to the Pen to Publish podcast with your hosts, Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher, and
Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader.
Hi, and welcome to episode 5, The Writing Process Part 2. Now, last week we looked at how to start thinking of your ideas, and this included a good mulling session, as Alexa One put it. Thinking about your ideas and remembering who it is you're writing to will help solidify any ideas you have. And then it's a really good idea to write it down. I think we made that point very clear last time. So today, Alexa One will be talking about plans for fiction and children's books, as they are actually quite different from business books. So do take notes for this one. There's going to be a lot of information, and I'm going to be explaining all about the business side of things. So Alexa One, do you need a plan for fiction or children's books?
Well, yes. When you want to write a book, making the time to develop an outline for your story can be a brilliant Kickstarter. I wouldn't say that you must have a plan, because for some writers, that's just not the way they work. Some writers feel constrained by having a detailed outline in place when they start on the actual book. They feel it takes away their spontaneity when they're writing and doesn't allow the story to evolve in the same way. But others like to know in detail exactly where their story is going before they set off on the first chapter. Sophie Hannah is a crime fiction author who I love, makes the most detailed plans of her books prior to beginning to write. So basically the whole novel mapped out minutely, scene by scene. And I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to have a main direction for my stories set, but I don't necessarily know all the details, and more often than not, I don't know exactly how the ending will work when I start. Quite often, the ending will come to me when I'm sort of half or 3/4 of the way through, and it'll be like a light bulb moment. I'll think, oh, yes, that'd be a good ending. But with business books, do you need a plan in the same way?
Business books definitely require a plan. Why, you might be asking? Because unlike with fiction, you've got to be taking your reader on a journey, and that journey usually answers specific questions that you've outlined in the introduction. So this needs to be mapped out in such a way that you start with the problem, answer the question, and then give the reader clear solutions along the way. And trying to do this without a roadmap will be really difficult. This is why when I work with coaching clients, the first thing we do is plan the entire book. And anyone that doesn't finish that part of the process usually then either falls off the coaching program altogether because they find it too difficult, or they just don't get their book finished. Then we outline what each chapter will include, how the reader will then implement the information, and then any call to actions that the reader should make. Now, if you remember from an earlier podcast, writing a book for lead generation requires the reader to then get in touch with the author, as ideally you want the reader to then work with them, as in you, as in the business owner. Trying to do this ad hoc, so to speak, is really difficult. However, with a clear plan, and I'm a real fan of mind maps, I'll be giving some examples of these in the show notes. This makes the writing process so much easier. But I'll talk more about that and what to include a bit later. So, Alexa, more about fiction and how plans work for that.
Well, with fiction, whether you plan at all or how detailed your plan is very personal to you as a writer. But what I would say is, if you're a new writer, then a plan is really going to help you. For one thing, if you create a really detailed outline that takes you right the way through all the twists and turns of your story to some kind of logical wrapping up at the end, you can then start writing properly with far more confidence that you have a plot that works. You have a book idea that you can actually see through to the finish. There are other advantages too, and this is true of business books as well, as Alexa too has said, that a plan in fiction helps you keep track of your timeline and see that it works, particularly if your novel isn't progressing in a linear fashion. You know, maybe you want to use flashbacks. Maybe you want to start in the past and leap forward to the future. You know, maybe your book has more than one narrator, so you have different voices telling different chapters. These are all elements that can be hard to keep track of unless you've made a plan for yourself to follow that works with everything laid out. And a plan gives you a complete picture of your book, which allows you to see whether the story has balance or whether you're spending too much time on one character or one plot element that may not be that important or interesting in the grander scheme. A plan also highlights the plot blanks. It highlights the plot flaws. It gives you the opportunity to fill the story out properly and correct what doesn't work before you start the actual writing. I think it must be so disheartening for a writer to be all excited and launch into their book only to come up against problem after problem with the storyline. And that's when you're more likely to give up. A good, solid, detailed plan makes giving up far less likely. And a plan helps you to see where you can introduce subplots appropriately. It's hard to just drop in other story threads effectively without a framework that ensures they fit, especially for new and less experienced writers. A plan is basically your path to creating the progression and flow of your main plot and your subplots. So let me talk a bit about stages now for planning your book. A good place to start with a plan is just to write a synopsis of your story, so the bare bones of the plot that you can then start to build on in more detail. Once you have your synopsis, just like a play that you go to see at the theatre, you can think of your novel as having acts, so segments that comprise roughly the beginning, the middle, and the run up to the ending. If you break up your story like this, it really helps with creating a structure, and you can establish that for yourself in your plan. So in the beginning chapters, you're going to be doing a lot of introducing the characters and the relationships between them, the setting, both physical and in terms of time, where any conflict lies. Exactly what is this journey that you're taking your main characters on? And although potential readers will have read the back cover blurb and know in essence what type of story you're presenting, the early chapters of the book are also where you need to establish the tone, the atmosphere, where you give your readers something that's going to keep them reading. How you're going to do that can go in your plan. The middle section of a book can be tricky, and you may have an idea of where you want your story to go, but the ending still seems way off, and somehow you have to keep the reader interested until you can enter that final phase. So ask yourself, what else can I introduce here? What new details can emerge about your characters? How can the relationships develop? Look at your subplotting. What's going on there? Is there anything you can go into more deeply without detracting from the main thrust of the story? Is there anything you can resolve, perhaps? Then once you get to the point of planning your ending, be aware of all the strands you've created and make sure you tie each one up. Look back through the events you've mapped out. Are you giving the proper weight to each element? How are you building up to the denouement? Where are you injecting the pace in these final chapters? And then when you've done all that, I'm afraid that's not the end of your plan, because what you've now built is an overview. But if you want your plan to be detailed enough to carry you through the writing of your book, now is the time to go into it even more deeply and break your story down into scenes. Think of it as a film. Every scene in a film tells more of the story. Well, that's what you want the scenes in your book to do, so plan out each one. Who's involved? What are they thinking or feeling? What action takes place? Where does it happen? Now, it might seem laborious, but you have to work this all out anyway to tell your story. And by doing it before you start to write, you're giving yourself such a boost. When I'm writing, I find it crucial to know where I'm going with the story next. Apart from anything else, it stops me wasting my writing time, sitting there and thinking, I don't know what happens next. Now, imagine, Alexa, too, that this is the same with business books, that you have to know every step of the way where you're going.
Absolutely. As I mentioned at the beginning, planning your business book out can include any of the following, because we obviously don't have a beginning, middle, and an end. I mean, we do. We obviously have an introduction, the chapters, and then the conclusion, but we don't have the same elements as a fiction book. But we do need to take the reader on a journey, as I said before. So how you plan your book out is a little bit different, obviously, with business books. And these are the elements that I would suggest you have in your book. You have a foreword, which is written by somebody else. And this is usually talking about the importance of the issue being spoken about. You then have a table of contents, which obviously outlines everything that's going to be in the book. You then have an introduction, which again outline what the book is going to cover, including how to read the book. People really like to have that as an added little oh, I need to read this book sequentially, or whether or not you can pick up the book and just read the bits that interest you. Then come the chapters, which should take the reader on a journey. Usually it starts with outlining the issue and then finishing with the solution. Each chapter can start with a what are we going to cover and end with a recap. I really like that format for business books because I feel it really helps the reader understand exactly what's going to be in the chapter and then a nice little summary at the end. Call to actions. This is getting the reader to do something, either visit a website or getting in touch with the author. And I make sure that we have those planned out throughout the book, usually because the call to actions can then be tailor-made to the situation or the problem that the chapter is talking about. And then we have a conclusion. This sums the entire book up and reminds the reader of any important details. You can then have resources, a glossary, an index, an about the author page, and obviously acknowledgements. As you can see, there's a lot to think about with business books. So having these mapped out before you begin will really help you with your writing journey. When you have an outline ready to go, you literally just fill in the gaps. Now, obviously, with business books, we don't talk about characters and people per se, apart from maybe case studies. So, Alexa One, character development must be really important in fiction books. How do you plot those out? How do you get a feel for those?
Well, the detailed thought and planning that goes into your plot lines can be helpful with your characters too. You want your readers to engage with and remember the characters you create. So they need to have individual personality traits. They need to have life backgrounds, likes and dislikes, things they're good at, things they're not so good at, families they get on with or don't get on with. They need to have close friends and they need to have difficult relationships. And what do they look like physically? Basically, they need to be complete people with complete lives so that they're believable. Now, even if you don't bring all these things into their particular story, you'll still find it really helpful to have developed character descriptions with this sort of detail in, because you need to know these people that you're writing about. Detailed character descriptions also provide really useful reference points for consistency. You know, if you start out mentioning that someone was born in Skipton, say, having that written down in your character plan becomes like a cross-check for you so that elsewhere in the book, you don't end up saying they were born in Harrogate. Descriptions also help to remind you of your character's personality traits so that you don't have them behaving inconsistently with who they are, unless that's part of the plot, of course. But having said all that about planning, it's still your story, it's your book. And even if you have a detailed plot and character plan in place, that doesn't mean that you can't deviate from it. Sometimes when I'm writing, my story will weirdly appear to take on a life of its own. A conversation will somehow go somewhere I wasn't expecting, and that opens up a new direction. So I think that in the actual writing of your book, you may well find that possibilities open up that you hadn't thought of. And they may be good possibilities too that you don't want to leave out. So then you can go back to your plan to see where you can make those adjustments. I don't think having a detailed outline needs to be stifling. You just need to see it as a solid foundation to build on, but not something immovable that's going to sap your creative energy. Again, having said that, there's always an again. With children's picture books, I think perhaps the plan does need to be rather more fixed, and Alexa 2 works a lot with children's picture books. So how important is it, do you think, to fix what you're doing with a picture book and not deviate?
So with picture books, it's really important to have a plan. I mean, a lot of people think, well, picture books surely are the easiest books to write because it's just a bunch of pictures and probably 300 words, I think you said in the podcast when we talked about how many number of words for picture books. But actually, a plan for children's books is essential. Now, why, you might be asking? Well, you're going to be involving 2 other people in your creation, your illustrator and the typesetter. And having a mapped out detailed plan of where the illustrations are going to go will then work with where the text will be placed, and obviously how the illustrator needs to accommodate that. This then indicates what pages have a 2-page spread. That's where a picture covers both pages. and which pages will be text only. I've had many children's authors come to me with their book ready to be typeset. They send me the illustrations and then the text, but the two haven't been thought out together and how they actually fit. And then we have to get back to the illustrator to redo the pictures to accommodate the text. This is really costly and it takes time. Now, I've written a guide, which I'll give you links to in the show notes, and it talks all the way through how you can plan your book out and what you need to bear in mind when writing a children's book. So always plan your picture books out, even if it's a Blue Peter type project where you literally get pages from your printer, you stick them together to make a proper book, and then you can outline exactly where the pictures are going to go, where the text is going to go, and then also where the illustrator needs to leave blank space in the picture so that the text doesn't get hidden or hard to read. So that's all about the children's and business books. And I think there's quite a lot of information there, but I think Alexa's just going to wrap up with a quick summary of everything that we've spoken about.
Well, yes, there's definite overlaps with business books and with fiction. As I mentioned, I think with fiction, it's quite a personal choice how detailed that you want to make that plan. But I do think for a new writer, you want that detail. You want to give yourself that basis from which to write your book. It helps you keep track of timelines. It helps you with consistency. It helps you keep your character names the same. I've edited books where the author suddenly decided partway through either to change the name or they've inadvertently changed the name. And if you have it all mapped out in the first place, that's far less likely to happen because you can keep going back to your plan to remind yourself of what your initial thoughts were. And then once you have a plan, you then need to work out how long you're going to spend on your writing, when you're going to find the time. And this is quite exciting because it's when writing then becomes a habit, it becomes part of your daily living. And we're going to be talking about that more next week, about getting into good writing habits, how much time you do need to spend, perhaps how many words you're going to set yourself to write in each writing session. And we'll also be talking in a little bit more detail about formatting requirements. So another good episode, hopefully. And we hope you'll join us then. Bye-bye from me.
And it's a bye-bye from me. See you next week.